The winter of 1888 didn't just arrive in the high country of the Wyoming Territory. It conquered. The wind sweeping down from the jagged peaks of the granite ranges didn't ask permission before it rattled the frosted window panes of Ethan's ranch house. It was a violent, demanding sound, a howling gale that had become the only conversation Ethan held in the evenings since the silence had taken up permanent residence in his hallways. Ethan was a man built of rough-hewn timber and silence, his hands scarred from barbed wire and the unforgiving bite of winter rains. He moved through his life with the heavy endurance of a draft horse that has forgotten the feeling of an unburdened back. For 3 years, since the fever had swept through the valley and taken the voices of his brother and sister-in-law, he had existed rather than lived. He kept the ranch running solely for the sake of his young niece, Sophie, who slept in the room at the top of the stairs. The days were measured in fence posts and cattle counts, and the nights were measured in the ticking of the grandfather clock that stood like a judge in the hallway. However, it was only recently that the smell of the house had changed. The atmosphere had shifted from the stale dust of a bachelor's grief to something sharper, warmer, and infinitely more alive. It was the scent of ginger, star anise, and slow-simmered bone broth that seeped from the kitchen from dawn until dusk. This change was the work of Leanne, the quiet woman who had arrived at the foreman's hiring call 3 months ago, offering to cook for the hands in exchange for a wage Ethan knew was too low for the magic she worked on tough venison and dry flour. Ethan rarely saw her. She moved like a shadow, placing steaming plates on the long communal table and vanishing before a thank you could be uttered. Her eyes were always downcast, her posture one of apology for simply taking up space. On this particular Tuesday, the snow had begun to fall with a cruel determination, dusting the yard in a deceptive white purity. Ethan sat by the dying fire in the main house, nursing a cup of cold coffee. He watched the kitchen door through the archway, expecting to see the faint light under the jamb extinguish as Leanne retreated to the bunkhouse annex. He had assumed the foreman, Miller, had set her up in the annex, a small but heated room usually reserved for injured hands. But the light died and the back door creaked open. Through the window, Ethan saw a small, bundled figure step out into the swirling white, heading not toward the bunkhouse, but toward the decaying, drafty structure of the old hay barn 50 yards away. The sight struck Ethan with the force of a physical blow. A sudden, sick turning in his gut had nothing to do with the coffee. He waited, watching the faint glow of her lantern swing through the biting dark until it disappeared into the gaps of the barn's siding. The realization washed over him. She wasn't sleeping in the annex. She wasn't sleeping in a room at all. Ethan stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. He grabbed his heavy buffalo hide coat, stepping out into the biting wind to follow the small footprints already being erased by the snow. The cold was instantaneous, searing the inside of his nose. He marched across the yard, boots crunching through the crust, his mind racing with confusion and guilt. Inside the barn, the air was colder than the night outside, damp with the smell of old hay and horses. The wind whistled through the gaps in the wood. There, in a stall that offered no protection, he found her. She was curled beneath a single thin wool blanket, shivering on a pile of straw. She had created a pathetic nest in a place meant for livestock. Ethan stood in the shadows, the lantern in his hand trembling. It wasn't from the cold, but from an overwhelming wave of shame. He looked at the woman who fed his household sleeping like a discarded animal. He felt the weight of his own negligence. In his grief-stricken blindness, focusing only on the ledger, he had allowed this cruelty to fester under his own roof. He cleared his throat, a low rumble. Leanne jumped, scrambling backward into the corner of the stall, eyes wide with terror. No person should look at another with the expectation of violence. She pulled the thin blanket tighter, her breath hitching in white puffs, and whispered a frantic apology in broken English, assuming she was being evicted. Ethan stepped forward, raising the lantern to illuminate his face, trying to soften his scowl. He spoke quietly, his voice rusty but firm. He told her she would not sleep here, not tonight, not ever again. His words hung in the freezing air like a contract. He did not wait for her to argue or gather the few pitiful possessions arranged on an overturned crate, a comb, a cracked mirror, and a red ribbon. He gestured toward the open barn door where the lights of the main house glowed. Leanne hesitated, fear warring with the bone-deep cold. Ethan realized she was waiting for the catch, the price that usually accompanied such offers. He softened his posture. He told her there was a room in the house, a room that had been empty and gathering dust, and it was hers. No debt owed, simply because it was right. The walk back was silent. When he ushered her into the warmth of the kitchen, the heat seemed to stagger her. Ethan led her through the quiet hallway to the guest room on the first floor. It had a sturdy quilt, a fireplace he immediately knelt to light, and a door that locked from the inside. He placed the key in her trembling palm, closing her fingers over the cold metal gently. He told her to rest. When he left her and walked back to his own cold room, Ethan felt a strange sensation in his chest, a cracking of the ice that had encased him for 3 years. The next morning broke with a sky the color of bruised iron. Inside, the tension of the unknown vibrated in the air. Ethan woke early, pacing the kitchen, listening for movement. He was terrified she might have fled, unable to trust the sudden fortune. But the door opened, and Leanne emerged. She wore a clean, faded tunic, her hair smoothed back with precision. She stopped when she saw him, eyes lowering, body curling inward. Ethan pointed to the heavy oak table where he and Sophie took their meals, not the counter where she usually stood. He set a chair for her. It was a command disguised as an invitation. She sat gingerly, looking at the empty plate as if it were a trap. Then came the sound of running feet. Sophie burst into the room, hair a tangle of sleep. She stopped short at the sight of the stranger. Sophie, with the acceptance of a child who craves connection, climbed into her own chair and asked Leanne if she knew how to braid hair. The question hung in the air. Ethan watched as Leanne slowly raised her eyes to the child. A small, tentative smile broke across her face. She nodded and reached out to smooth a lock of hair from Sophie's forehead, her fingers moving with reverence. Breakfast was quiet, but for the first time in years the silence wasn't empty. Ethan ate without tasting, noticing the weary lines around Leanne's eyes and the strength in her hands. By bringing her out of the cold, he had brought a heartbeat back into the mausoleum. Days turned into weeks as winter deepened. The snow piled up, forcing them into a domestic proximity that wore away the sharp edges of their strangeness. Ethan found reasons to linger over coffee, drawn by a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. He watched Leanne move through the house, no longer a shadow but a presence. Her touch appeared in small changes, a mended curtain, dried wildflowers on the mantel, Sophie's neatly folded clothes. Her labor felt less like servitude and more like an offering. One evening, while the wind howled outside, Ethan sat by the fire mending a bridle. Leanne sat opposite, teaching Sophie a game with smooth river stones. Ethan watched the firelight dance on Leanne's face, softening her guarded expression. He felt a sudden urge to know the history behind those dark, intelligent eyes. He asked her, voice low, where she learned to cook with such spice. Leanne paused, looking at him directly for the first time. She spoke of a village near a great river, of a father who taught her the balance of flavors, and of a journey across an ocean followed by the breaking of her back on the railroads of the West. She spoke in sentences stitched together with pauses, but in those pauses, Ethan heard echoes of loss that resonated with his own. She looked at the fire, a tear track glistening on her cheek. Without thinking, he placed his rough hand over hers on the table. She did not pull away. For a moment, the only sound was the popping of the logs and the rhythm of three hearts in a house becoming a home. The fragile peace was tested when the weather broke enough for the monthly supply run to Blackwood Ridge. Ethan harnessed the team, dreading the trip. He helped Leanne and Sophie onto the wagon, noticing how Leanne wrapped her shawl to hide her face. The ride into town was silent. As they rolled down the main street, Ethan felt the town's judgmental gaze. Heads turned. The silence was sharp and filled with accusations. When Ethan stopped at the Mercantile, he helped Leanne down, his hands lingering on her waist, a defiant claim of protection. Mrs. Gable, the town's self-appointed moral arbiter, stood on the boardwalk, arms crossed. She stepped forward, boots clicking ominously, and asked Ethan if he was having trouble finding decent help, her voice sweet with poison. Ethan stiffened, turning his body into a wall between the woman and Leanne. He looked Mrs. Gable in the eye, voice low and dangerous. He stated he had found the best help in the valley, and that decency was measured by kindness, not origin. He ushered Leanne and Sophie into the store, leaving Mrs. Gable shocked in the cold. But inside he saw Leanne's hands trembling. He knew the war for their peace had begun. Ethan moved through the store with a protective energy. He bought a heavy wool coat dyed deep indigo and draped it over Leanne's shoulders in the aisle, a public declaration that she was under his care. But as they headed back to the hills, the silence in the wagon was heavy with the knowledge that the world would not let them be happy without a fight. The indigo coat became a second skin for Leanne. She wore it even indoors, as if holding on to the warmth. In the weeks following, the ranch's isolation deepened, but the silence inside shifted to a resonant awareness. One evening, after Sophie was tucked in, the house settled into an intimate quiet. Ethan sat in his chair distracted, watching Leanne mend the sheet. He felt a deep longing to bridge the distance between them. The awl in his hand slipped, slicing his thumb. He hissed in pain. Before the blood could bead, Leanne was there. She took his rough hand in hers, guiding him to the water basin. Her touch was cool against his skin. As she washed the cut, Ethan couldn't look away from her face, the furrow of concentration between her brows. "It is deep," she murmured. She tore a strip of cloth to bind it, fingers brushing his wrist where his pulse hammered. The scent of soap and star anise made his head swim. The proximity stripped away the layers of employer and employee. He wanted to tell her the cut meant nothing, that he would bleed just to have her tend to him, but the words stuck. He watched her tie the knot, his other hand hovering near her waist before dropping. She paused, sensing the gesture, and looked up. The air was thick enough to drown in. Then she stepped back, cheeks flushed, and retreated, leaving Ethan with his heart thundering. Spring arrived with the violent upheaval of the thaw. The mud and swelling creek brought a rider to the gate, a man on a roan horse with the bearing of official business. Ethan met him on the porch. Leanne watched from the window. The rider handed over a sealed envelope. It was a letter from the town council, signed by the judge, citing concerns regarding the moral environment for Sophie, and questioning the propriety of an unmarried foreign woman residing with a bachelor. Ethan read the words, cold fury settling in his gut. They were threatening to take Sophie, using Leanne as the weapon. He crushed the paper. "You tell the judge," Ethan growled, "that my home is not open for his debate, and anyone who comes for my kin best come ready for a war." The rider, spooked, spurred his horse away. Ethan turned to find Leanne in the doorway, face pale. She knew. She looked at the crumpled paper, and then his face, eyes filling with devastating resignation. Ethan walked past her, throwing the letter into the fire, but the poison had already leached into the room. She turned away, building a wall of silence he could not climb. That night the wind rattled the eaves. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. A soft creak from the hallway made him sit up, the guest room door, then the front latch. Panic, sharper than fear, drove him out of bed. He burst onto the porch as a figure descended into the moonlit yard. Leanne, wearing the blue coat and carrying a bundle, was walking toward the gate. Ethan vaulted the railing, sprinting through the mud to catch her. He grabbed her arm, spinning her around. Her face was wet with tears. She tried to pull away, voice cracking. "I am the poison here," she whispered. "They will take her because of me." Ethan refused to let go, pulling her close against the cold. "You are not poison," he said, voice shaking. "You are the only thing that has made this house a home. You are the fire in the hearth, Leanne." He looked down at her, shock. Protecting her reputation wasn't enough. He had to claim her. "You aren't leaving. I won't let you. Not because of the cooking or the child, but because I cannot walk back into that house if you aren't in it." The confession hung between them. Slowly he lowered his head and kissed her, a desperate, sealing promise made in the dark, tasting of salt and wind. Leanne stiffened, then melted against him, hands clutching his coat as the wind howled around the fortress they had just built. The morning sun rose with blinding clarity. Ethan dressed in his stiff black Sunday suit, shaving with a steady hand. He went to the kitchen where Leanne was preparing breakfast. Her movements were quiet but peaceful. He took the spoon from her hand. "Leave the porridge," he said softly. "We have business in town." He woke Sophie and told her to put on her blue dress. They climbed into the wagon, the air smelling of new grass. Ethan drove with purposeful cadence, past the barn, onto the main road. Leanne sat beside him. Halfway to town, he took her hand, interlacing their fingers in open view of the sky. He squeezed her hand, let them look. In Blackwood Ridge, he drove straight to the church where the judge held office. He guided Leanne and Sophie up the steps, ignoring the stairs. Inside, Ethan marched to the judge's desk. "I received your letter," he said, voice calm, "and I am here to settle the matter of propriety." He looked at Leanne, standing tall and dignified. "We require a license, and a witness, unless the law forbids a man from marrying the woman who saved his life." The judge looked from Ethan's steel gaze to Leanne's grace. The bureaucratic hardness melted. He reached for his ledger. "No," the judge said softly. "The law has no quarrel with love, Mr. Ethan." By the summer solstice, the ranch was unrecognizable. The snow had retreated, leaving a lush tapestry of green. The air was filled with cattle calls and Sophie's laughter. The old hay barn had been pulled down, its planks repurposed into a sturdy porch wrapping around the house. Rocking chairs sat overlooking the garden Leanne had coaxed from the earth, bok choy growing beside potatoes. Ethan stood on the porch as the sun dipped, wiping sweat from his brow. He watched Sophie chase a foal. The screen door creaked, and Leanne stepped out with lemonade, the ice clinking like luxury. She was no longer the frightened creature in the barn. She moved with ownership, her face filled out with happiness. She leaned against him, hand on his chest. Ethan wrapped his arm around her, inhaling the scent of jasmine. They didn't speak. The walls no longer held secrets. He looked at the reflection in the window and thought of the emptiness before. It was a beautiful home, filled with the mercy of second chances. He kissed the top of her head. As the first star appeared, he knew the long winter was finally, truly over.